welcome everyone to Creating Connections. This is a discussion panel series from Destiny Arts Center. Tonight's discussion, we're going to be talking about consent in the time of COVID. I am your host, Shanna Bowie. I am the Arts Center Program Manager here at Destiny Arts Center. And we're going to start things the way we always start things at Destiny, with a meditation led by our martial arts director, Tess. So Tess, you want to get us started?
Yes. Hi all. Let's meditate. Let's organize ourselves and be present. And if it helps you, you can close your eyes. Take a deep breath. Let's collectively take 3 deep breaths in our own speed. Relaxing our jaw. Loosening our shoulder. Our chest. If you're sitting, let your spinal cord elongate as you settle down to the ground as well. And let the earth hold your weight, or let your body rest on earth. Deep breath. Breathe in. Think of one thing besides yourself that you connected with. Nature. That's natural, something you connect. Breath. And let's take another 3 deep breaths collectively, our own speed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tess. Part of the reason that I asked Tess to lead this meditation is because tonight's discussion is talking about our bodies and how do we honor our bodies and the bodies of others. So I'm actually going to ask all of our panelists to come on screen. And what we're going to do is I'm going to have each person introduce yourself, talk a little bit about what your experience has been like talking about consent. And we have a lovely panel of like educators, young people, Destiny affiliated folks, non-Destiny affiliated folks. And I just want us to talk a little bit about what consent culture the current landscape looks like, how that has shifted, and what we imagine for the future of that. So I'm actually going to start with Kasum because it was your comment during our check-in that we had that inspired this discussion. So can you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your experience?
Sure. Shanna, you said my experience in regards to consent. Is that what you're asking?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Kasum, and I have been working with young people for the last 17, 18 years. I also worked with sexual assault survivors for over 10 years as a rape crisis counselor, and I've done almost 10 years of somatic training around trauma, around how trauma is in our body. And I think all of that relates to consent. I've done a lot of young women's groups, done specific work with young women in schools. And interestingly, Shannon, when you text me and asked me to do this, I had some of my old students at my house and they just started talking about, Miss Kasum, you always talk about consent. We used to play this video, the T of consent. Like if it's, I don't know if anyone's seen it, it's like a stick figure, a little cartoon thing about what consent means and how do we uphold it. And so consent has been a part of dialogue, conversation with young people in my life for a very long time. And I think for me, when COVID hit and during this time, it kept hitting me like this is a huge, massive experience in consent. And how do we understand what we personally need, from others? It is a time when there's so much different information and we all have a different level of knowing about certain things. We all have different priorities in our lives and our families and our experiences. So there's no one way to go about things. And so consent to me felt like such a huge part of this process. Instead of following along with all the things that someone maybe says, like each person has a different experience. And consent, and we'll get into it later too, but for me, one of the big things is around boundaries and really learning. Consent is not only learning how to ask for consent, but it's also learning how to receive consent, and boundaries are such a huge part of that. So I don't want to go on and on, there's a lot more to say, but yeah, consent is such a huge practice. And I think COVID-19 has really thrust us into this huge collective practice of how we actually ask for what we need, because all of our needs are different. And thank you for inviting me and being here. It's nice to be a part of this group.
Thank you. Also, I have to point out that Kasum is also one of our caregivers. Her young person goes to Destiny. So I'm always really excited to call upon the resources that we already have in our community, as well as bringing in outside folks. So I am gonna throw it to Nuela, who is joining us all the way from the East Coast. Can you tell us a little bit about your work?
Yes, hey everybody. So I'm based in Philly. My name's Nuela. My pronouns are she and her. I'm based in Philly, but I'm from Rhode Island, so that's where I'm speaking from right now. I'm visiting my family. So I came to this work in terms of consent education and advocacy as a filmmaker. So about 10 years ago, I made a film about street harassment, right? Unwanted attention in public space. And at the time, I just wanted to tell a story because I was frustrated and I felt like I wanted to address it through the medium I knew how. And that film really took me on a journey to learn more about consent, rape culture. I ended up helping young people make films about the topics. And then out of that grew a consent workshop program in Philly schools. And so for about 6 years, I was leading workshops in mostly in high schools, where we would use this media about consent to talk about these issues. And what I found was that street harassment was a really great entry point to have those conversations, because it's just so common, right? And it's easier to talk about maybe than like more aggressive forms of sexual violence. But right now, my latest kind of work in the field is around working with other educators. And so I co-founded a group called Educators for Consent Culture. And we're really pushing Philly schools to do better, to teach consent education to make sure that young people are and everyone in the schools is aware of what consent is and how to create a consent culture in our schools. And so obviously right now it's different because young people aren't in schools physically, but we're continuing the conversation in creative ways and trying to engage community. So I think I'm really excited for this conversation about consent in light of COVID. And I definitely will share some personal stories and you know, challenges that I've had, and because it's a different terrain, right? So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Great. And I also want to hear from Ruben, who is joining us from Our Joy.
Hey, how you doing? Hey everyone. My name is Ruben. I'm the restorative justice coordinator at Our Joy. I've been doing restorative justice for like the past 8 years. Worked in group home facilities, juvenile detention halls. I worked in a group home for teenage mothers. So I've definitely seen a lot of situations, also resolved a lot of situations that involved consent. And I think for me, you know, consent is definitely boundaries, and just really coaching and teaching young people, especially young men, how to engage young ladies and be respectful. I think a lot of times we get caught up in culture and, you know, music, and it has a lot of derogatory things that, you know, kind of give us the messages as a young man. And a lot of times we don't have a mentor or a adult figure or a positive male role model that teaches how to engage with young women. You know what I'm saying? So I definitely want to continue that fight, and you know, be able to, you know, talk about accountability, the responsibility of standing up and not being a bystander, and really just like, you know, calling it out when it happens, and, you know, just really making sure that we can continue this conversation. So I'm glad to be here. So thank you.
And now I'm going to throw it to some of our young people. I am going to start with Monique. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're coming from, and your experience with talking about consent?
Hi, I'm Monique. I live in Oakland, California, born and raised, and I just finished high school, where I was a FIRE senior, which stands for Peer Health Initiative, Resources, and Education. And it's essentially a peer mentoring program where a group of 16 seniors helps out the sophomores in their wellness and decision-making class. And so at the end of the year, we were coming off with consent as our closing sort of discussion as part of our sexual health and awareness unit. And unfortunately, due to COVID, we weren't able to have in-person discussions that the FIRE seniors could facilitate. So I was involved in putting together a document of resources and trying to make it sort of a dialogue, even virtually, even on paper, for the sophomores to have access to. Consent is something that matters hugely to me. I think that it's something that we can really be changing the narrative about in this point in time. And I'm very, very much into discussing the distinction between no means no and yes means yes, and the concept of enthusiastic consent rather than just the bare minimum. So that's sort of where I'm approaching it from.
And I'm going to Kira.
Hi, so I'm Kira. My pronouns are she, her as well. And pretty similarly to Monique, we both just graduated from the same high school, and I was also part of the FIRE program. I didn't compile the document because Monique's just better than me, but I did work and have my own little group of sophomores, and we talked a little bit about consent before the pandemic started. And I don't want to take up too much time because I think a lot of people have already said the way that I think about consent. But most recently, I read an op-ed that I thought was really interesting. That was about, I think the title was like, we should stop teaching our children to hug adults. And it was kind of, I just hadn't, for me, a lot of consent, the discussions around consent start in middle school, around puberty, or in high school. And I guess one of the things that I've been thinking about is how it really should start much sooner, with just like, no child has a responsibility to hug anyone even if they're a family friend, or do anything they don't want to do. It's just been things I've been thinking about. So thank you for having me, by the way.
Kira was also our intern last summer. So love Kira. And Rose, I definitely want to hear, because not only is Rose one of our Destiny folks who, this is Rose's third Creating Connections panel, but Rose specifically reached out and said, I want to talk about this issue. Tell us a little bit about why you wanted to be here tonight.
Yes. My name is Rose Hurd. I'm a part of the Destiny Arts Youth Performance Company. I really wanted to be a part of the panel tonight because of my experience with sexual violence, and my experience within communities that are trusted communities with sexual violence. And yeah, I also go to Berkeley High, and there's a lot of stuff blowing up right now at Berkeley High surrounding consent and sexual assault and sexual abuse in general, and the rape culture that is at Berkeley High. So I've been leading discussions amongst youth and adults surrounding consent. And so, yeah, I wanted to be here. I wanted to participate in any way that I could. So thank you for having me.
And Arisika, am I saying your name correctly? Okay, good. Arisika is part of our Elders Company and is joining us tonight. Also, thank you for joining us for put out the call to the elders. It's like, is anyone interested in joining? And Arisika stepped up.
So I just want to say that the issue of consent, as someone who's 71, I have seen, the unwanted touching of women and children. I've just seen, from the time I was a teenager, if not before. And one of the things you always want was, as I've a veteran of many different social justice movements, is wanting it to be at an end, and so I'm really happy, and part of it, unwanted touching, consent, are on that slippery slope that goes, can start maybe with unwanted, touching, and then go all the way down to outright rape or sexual assault. And so you want to interrupt it, and I was so glad that the statement around, how we expect, children so often, give me a little, give your aunt a little sugar, it's like, that's something we really, really need to interrupt. And I think I feel this as an intergenerational aspect so strongly. I was raped, I'm an adult woman, I was raped as a 20-year-old. My son was molested in his elementary school, and my granddaughter had to hide herself and lock a bathroom door. And so that issue of the way this moves through the generations, and really wanting to stop and noticing, like, terms like that, many times this term ravishing, which can be in books, it's not said so much, but it really means, oh, you look so beautiful, I want to rape you. I mean, that's what so moving certain language out of the vocabulary and calling out when people use certain forms of language, and that all unwanted touch, there's no such thing as a touch of the hand. It's all on that slippery slope, and we need to end it. We just need to end it. So thank you.
Thank you. I see Malcolm is joining us. Malcolm, I'm gonna call on you in just one second. Tess, I would love for you to talk a little bit about your idea of like consent and boundaries from the point of view of martial arts. You are muted, Tess.
Sorry about that. As a male, but also like seeing from a personal perspective and in community as well, how sometimes being raised in a way that not being every day of your life and not having that awareness of the other side where people are going through that, and for me to learn and incorporate into the teaching of consent and martial arts that the young people I teach to. In my other job, I'm also a somatic coach, which this is part of my teaching too. So one of the things we have at Destiny is teaching morals in a way that there is Destiny code we have, that is love, care, respect, responsibility, honor, and peace. And each of these core language we have is all embedded, including teaching young people into their learning about their body and awareness of their body, but also understanding of distance in a way, respecting yourself and others, consent being part of that, like cornerstone in a way. Do I do this without the other person giving me permission? And how do I, not just knowing people touching me, how do I gauge and understand the other side and read and be aware of what's happening in my surroundings? So it's embedded into the forms and saying, I'm doing this and I'm doing this for the sake of this. And when this happens, here's how I know that my boundary is crossed. It doesn't only has to be physical, right? It's emotional. It's more than just we talking about the body being touched. So that concern is embedded in teaching, and part of me is the more I learn, not just ideally having it, but visually people have to learn what it means to have consent. Yeah.
Thank you. Malcolm, thank you for joining us. The question that I've been asking people is just to introduce themselves and kind of talk about what their experience has been with consent or discussing consent or engaging in the practice of consent.
Okay. Hey, what's good, y'all? How you doing? The discussions I've actually had on consent, I mean, I feel like it's a really big thing that should often be seen as common sense, you know? And I feel like it isn't, even like ah, man, I wasn't even ready yet. Okay, I'm gonna start. All right, so my perspective of consent is that, I feel like it should be something seen as common sense, but it's not often, it's often ignored, And a few discussions I've had is like, all the discussions I've had are usually straightforward, After like, it's just a topic that no means no, I feel like the word no should be taken pretty strongly, After that, I know quite a few women that have, matter of fact, basically all women that have been a victim of that type of oppression when it comes to like men taking advantage of them and vice versa. I've seen men get taken advantage of, and then they get called not masculine when they deny a woman, in some cases. And I feel like in both perspectives, that shouldn't be taken lightly, and it should always be taken seriously.
Thank you. So I guess my first question, this is directed a little bit towards the educators in the group, but feel free, anybody, to answer, is how do we teach consent to young people? Also, like at Destiny, we deal with kids ages 3 all the way up to 18. So how do we like talk about or teach consent in a way that's age appropriate? And anyone can jump in on that.
I can start out. I would say, meet them where they are, just like with anything else. If you're talking to teenagers, I have found, and even like middle school age, that talking about street harassment is a really great entry point, as I mentioned earlier, because so many of us it's like a daily thing. And people, they have a lot to say. I think with younger children, I mean, obviously, like someone mentioned earlier, forcing kids to like hug, other adults, conversations about hugging and even play, right? Like, how are kids playing with each other? Are you listening to each other? Are you respecting each other's boundaries? Yeah, I would say kind of just meet them where they are, and as they get older, the conversation will get more complicated, right, and more nuanced. And obviously, there's all these layers. I think when it comes to high school, it's important that young people are able to situate consent and sexual violence in a within rape culture. Like, they're old enough in high school to understand what rape culture is, right, and how to disrupt that. You can talk about language. I mean, there's so many different things to talk about, but I think, yeah, age appropriate. That's the key word, key phrase.
I tend to do workshops for, older people, 20s and so, but part of me likes to think about that there's this egg of energy around your body. And it may be like about, I don't know if you can see me here, but maybe like 6, 8 inches from you. And that's your private, that's your space. And I say to people that energetically, even not touching, but even coming in here can violate your energetic space depending on your history. We all have different histories. And, in a lot of workshops, people are asked, to put their hands on somebody's heart, or, and I always say, you can put your hand over the body. 6 to 8 inches out is the energetic field. And I'm somebody who really feels I can feel more intensely if I am not physically touched, but touched in that space of energy. So I really like to talk about that you have an energy field, and it's your nerves go into that energy field, and that's your private space. And nobody gets to come into that unless you're invited. And I also like to say to people, I do an exercise sometimes where people witness each other moving, and they move through an image of grief or loss or reaching out for help. And I say, the witness without touch or without words has to support the mover, because sometimes the hurt is so deep that we cannot be touched. So how would you support people if you couldn't use language or you couldn't touch them? And I think it stretches people to understand that there are ways that we can offer support that don't involve touch. Touch is a wonderful healing modality when it's something you want. But if you don't know, and you don't know where the other person is, introducing the concept that we can support people without physical touch.
Thank you. I want to add on that. It's beautifully said about the energy field and being touched without physically being touched. One of the things we teach at Destiny, young people from 6 years old, is to learn that energy field. There is energy field that naturally, like we have animal instinct, where somebody gets to your hand, where other body, other self in their field, when it comes close, which is mostly arm length, you feel something. But there's a natural instinct that we're not taught in the schools. The school system has failed us from that point of view. So what we do is the kids will learn and it's both ways. It's the person who is violating and the person also who is feeling it. There are two ways of understanding the yin and yang. When the kids will learn walking towards and say, oh, now I can feel my energy field. And when somebody gets my energy bubble, I can feel in my chest or in my back. And it's a natural phenomenon. It is naturally built in us. We're not just trained. So one of the things we do at Destiny is really bring that awareness before even you go to a physical. And then learning how to say no. It's a certain muscle that we have to teach young people, where can you say no with conviction and with confidence that is as powerful as physical, even if not more. Having the power of your voice to say no powerfully, and that learning other side also being able to feel, and we, one thing is that we're not as a society being taught those qualities that we have naturally, and society is seeing only, oh, you're weak, you're strong, but there is different element of who we are that we need to build, and it's teaching that to young people. When do you know, even without you, before you talk, if the person does not want you in their energy field? Notice that, understand that, have consent, ask. So that kind of level of understanding and learning is what we need to teach, and that's what we also trying to teach at Destiny.
I want to jump off Tess. Thank you. All of everything that was been said is so good. What I was thinking a lot about is teaching the gut, and the gut has so much resource in it. Our gut has so much information about what actually feels right and feels not right. My experience, most of the young people, has been in high school age, and so you have more of a conversation about things, but it's still body-based. But raising a child, 11-year-old girl, what I've been trying to teach her a lot is really bringing her to her body and feeling energy. You know, she started riding the bus this year for the first time and going on AC Transit by herself. And I had to talk about, what do you feel in your body when you feel people get on the bus, and who you go to when you feel a certain sense that there's danger? What does that come in your body? Because we have a sense in our body that tells us things. And oftentimes as young people and adults, we don't get taught how to learn how to actually speak on what the feeling is. We learn how to cover it up because those feelings feel scary, or a lot of times we don't say it because we're scared of not having connection. So the fear of disconnection causes us to say a yes or a no when actually we want a no or a yes. And really our no's offer us a much more honest yes. And a friend of mine, and also a teacher in the somatics coaching world, I love it, Tess, I didn't know you're a somatics coach, but Prentice Hephill, who is just such a dynamic being, said, boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. And I think teaching boundaries and teaching our ability to know what is right for us is so important. And it makes me think about this. There's I've been trained in somatics through an organization called Generative Somatics, and we do a lot of standing practices. See, I know you knew them, Ted. But we have this one exercise that when I first started doing it blew me away. But then when I started doing it with teenage girls, it blew me away even more, where you're learning how to say no by having somebody walk in, asking a question. And this one time I did it with this young woman who, she was in a very abusive relationship with this young man. And she couldn't even let me come in. She just crumbled. Like, she couldn't even bring forth the mere no, much less actually push me away and guide me in a different direction. So our bodies, how we react to things, show how much we've embodied a yes or embodied a no. And Ruben, I so appreciate the work that you do with young men, because it's a two-sided thing. We have to learn how to respect people's no, and we also have to learn how to say no, because so often in our society, and this isn't just around sexual assault, this is around most things, when we say no to somebody, it rips apart people's egos. And it's like, my no has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me. And so learning how to receive no's can almost be as important as learning how to say them too. And so there's a mutuality around consent that is so much about boundaries, but also learning. I remember doing this one workshop where we had to go around and just ask questions to a bunch of people, and all you had to say is no, no, no. And it was so deep for me to feel how sad I was to hear no. I'm like, damn, do you not like me? You know, all these stories in our heads around what we feel when we hear no. And so it makes sense that we say yes just to stay in connection, just to stay in relationship. And so learning that our bodies, and learning that we have that truth inside of us that is the guide and direction towards everything, we have to instill that back into us, because so often we are just walking, even in COVID, to bring it back to COVID, it's so funny to me, like, stand 6 feet away. If you get 6 feet, it's like this whole thing. Do you know that's a government, they just threw that out there. Like, that's as far as spit can land. It's not, no, I don't know if people are whatever, really follow that. I'm sorry if I'm offending everyone, but thinking about what are we listening to versus what are we listening to in ourselves. And to me, the government doesn't dictate what I know for myself is the truth, though I'm always going to be in consent practice with people who I love because I care about what they need and I care about what I need. And so that is a mutual conversation based in what our needs are, and my needs are going to be different than what a good friend of mine's needs are. So it's the relationship, the conversation, and I'll leave it at that.
I want to throw a similar question to the young people, especially those who have talked about engaging in these conversations with other young people at your schools or leading some of these conversations. What has it been like to talk about this with, you know, people your age or around your age?
I mean, I can go if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I was just gonna say we didn't go into it too much in Wellness and Decision and the program that Monique and I did, but I think a lot of people had learned the basic idea of consent, and I think someone mentioned the tea video, like consent is like a cup of tea. People had learned that pretty well, but I don't know, they didn't always seem to actually understand what it meant and understand that it's something that you have to put in practice. It just it more seemed like they had a mantra and they knew the fill in the blank parts of the mantra, but I don't know if they'd actually like they got it in practice. But I think it's also hard. I haven't had experience with this, but with younger kids, just teaching about consent in a case where there is a power difference. Like I was thinking about this with teachers or with any adults where, especially in elementary school age, so much of teaching is like telling kids to respect authority and to understand that adults are the ones you have to listen to. But then at the same time, I think there needs to be more of a discussion that it's, you know, you also have your own boundaries. So there are places where you don't need to listen to adults. And I think that kind of part of that comes in the like stranger danger conversation. But that's still, I don't know. I just think that's such an important thing that doesn't always happen. But I personally haven't had experience talking to younger kids about that. But yeah.
Monique or Rose?
Yeah, I think a similar thing to Kira is that I also was a co-chair of the feminist union, so we had discussions of this sort. And something we noticed is that if 35 people came to the meeting, 33 of them would identify as female. And I think that the discussions that we had at Feminist Union were very different than the ones we had in Wellness and Decision Making, because I got the sense that a lot of the people who were choosing to be there felt consent in their body. They tied it to a specific moment. They tied it to an instance of street harassment, or God forbid, they tied it to another moment of harassment or assault. And so there was a lot more, I think, understanding of one's own boundaries and understanding the supreme importance of consent. Because I think what Kira touched on is that for a lot of the kids, especially the male identifying students, is that they're like, oh, okay, I get it, that yes means yes and no means no, but they don't understand like how that feels in the moment. And I also got the sense that a lot of people felt that it was, you know, asking for consent was a chore, and that it would ruin the vibe or that it would sort of interrupt the moment. And something that I definitely found myself saying over and over again is that like asking for consent is a beautiful thing. Like someone is giving you the opportunity to respect them and their body, and you doing that for them is such a beautiful and honorable thing. And it's sort of holy in my opinion, like at its core. So I think that something that we're still working on is getting rid of that narrative of that it's awkward or it's weird or it's annoying to ask for consent for every single touch, and that we should just be more chill about it. Because I think we still have internalized a lot of these things of like hug adults and let other people hug you. And I also think like you can ask for consent but still create an environment that does not allow someone to respond honestly. And understanding that just because you asked, you still have to read their body language and read what they're telling you in other ways, to really check that they feel comfortable at the moment, actually. So it's not enough to just ask, you also have to observe and pay attention. And I think that that's another thing that I saw that people still are having trouble grasping and working on.
I remember, I can't remember if it was high school or like freshman year of college. They like taught us like this thing, like when you do X, it makes me feel Y, and I wish you would do Z. And it was great, like with the, and they had us like practice. But I also remember leaving that like workshop and like all of us just laughing at it. We're like, we're never going to do this for real. Like, we're just not. And so I do think it's like part of it is about practice. How, like, I think it's so important that like we're having this conversation in, within Destiny, because it's like, how do we feel it in our bodies? It is easy to say words. How do we feel it in our bodies? Rose, did you want to talk a little bit?
Yeah, with the conversations that I've led, I've also noticed those patterns of discomfort when consent is discussed, especially around young men. And when in discussion with young women, I've noticed that we feel that there's like a lack of education that's being given on what consent truly means and what consent can mean for individual people, particularly in the Berkeley High community. Consent is not something that is ever taken seriously. There's so many stories being told right now where consent has been ignored completely. And I think that leads back to our education system and the fact that we are not taught about consent for more than that video discussing the tea. That's all the consent education that we get throughout our whole middle school and high school experiences. So for the discussions that I've held, it feels like a need, like it's necessary to start these discussions young and in elementary school, and talking about how to keep your hands to yourself, and talking about how to ask other children, oh, can I play with you in this way? And just keeping those discussions going throughout middle school and throughout high school, because there's such a lack of education on it. We're taught it for one day by being shown one video, and that's it for all of high school. And so then that results in a rape culture that is deeply instilled in the community. So yeah, that's what I've noticed.
Ruben, I don't want you to have to like speak for all and teaching all men about consent, but how are you addressing this with young men?
So one way, because the question you asked earlier was about learning, about how you can learn, right? And I can give you an example. I had a group. I think Mike Lee was here a second ago. He knows about this group of young men and women together, right? And this is basically restorative justice, right? And in that space, none of them knew each other from the start. But as we, had discussions around like, interactions between young men and young women, and just like how I think Kasum and a couple other folks said about like just saying things versus feeling things, you know what I'm saying? And it was the storytelling, right, that had the impact, and the feeling it gave people to hear what some of the young ladies and some of the young men were going through, right? Because we can talk about this in school, we can have the tea story, do all those things, but if somebody tells you, and of course it got to be age appropriate, if somebody tells you this is what I went through and this is how it makes me feel, or this is what happens to me when men engage me like this in public, it changes the whole feeling for a young man that might think that that's cool. You know what I'm saying? So for me, like creating these spaces, and I think Rose said it earlier that it's not being taught enough in schools. You need to have restorative justice circles in schools as much as possible, right? Where young women are both in those circles and having real conversations, you know, about what's happening in the streets, what's happening in the hallway, what interactions are happening between young men and women on social media. You know what I'm saying? All of these different things are so important to talk, because when you sit down and you have that conversation and you really get to hear the experience of another person or another human being, it creates this humanic like reaction of like, wow, like I feel bad that you even went through that. You know what I'm saying? Every human being feeling or their spirit when they sense that somebody is in pain or somebody just went through some trauma. You get what I'm saying? So when you're talking about something and having a conversation that is talking about a specific experience, or this is what I experience on a daily basis, it really gives you a way more realistic, organic experience rather than just like a cookie cut, you know, type of lesson plan where I just want to teach you how to respect and don't touch, don't do this. Nah, I need you to really understand the psychological effect of what this does to people. You know what I'm saying? Or the psychological and the trauma that it has on young men and young women, most importantly, that go through these things, you know, or have been violated before, and now, you know, that it's hard for them to get close to people, you know, or how they engage with people, and you don't even understand the dynamic until they give you that story. You know what I'm saying? So for me, like, I feel like with the work that I've done in terms of restorative justice, that's been like the most amazing experience, and probably the best conversations that I've had in terms of just having those conversations between young men and young women about the interactions and the relations that they have between each other. So I think that's one of the best tools you can use as a modality in the classroom or in any space, or in a place like Destiny Arts or Art Joy, or anywhere in the community and in the household. So yeah.
Can I just say really quickly that I want to acknowledge that it also takes like a facilitator who has the skills, right? Like Ruben, like you clearly, I haven't met you before tonight, but clearly you have the experience and the sensitivity and the wherewithal to command a room, to be able to make sure it's a safe space, a space where people are going to be able to have those brave conversations. Because, you know, I've facilitated many workshops, and in some cases, college students were facilitating, and I was there to kind of support. And there were some workshops that were really, really difficult. And it was just such an important reminder that we really got to make sure that when we're having these conversations, that we're creating a space, a container for them, right? Because not everybody's always ready to have this conversation in a way that's respectful, right? And so it's just really important. I want to urge like educators who are out there thinking, oh yeah, I want to talk to my students about this. Like, you really want to do your homework, talk to people who are experienced having these conversations. You want to make sure that young people are, ideally, that they're prepared, like they know that this conversation is happening, like you're not just springing it on them, right? Because there might be some young people who really don't want to be part of that conversation for whatever reason, right? Maybe they personally have been harmed, or maybe they are harm doer, and they're not ready to acknowledge that truth, right? And so there are a lot of different reasons why people might shut down. Some students might run out the room. Some students might just be totally disruptive. You know, there's a lot of, I'm happy to talk to anybody who really wants to get into this work about how to prepare for it. But thank you, Ruben. Clearly, you're doing some really important healing work, and I just want to acknowledge the skills that go into that.
Yeah, and I agree with you. This isn't for everybody, right? You definitely have to have a level of intelligence and experience to be able to create a container for those conversations to happen. You know what I'm saying? And please believe, when you hold these type of spaces, it exposes you as well, right? Because it talks about like your belief system, you know, what you you know, what you consider as the norm, Like all of those things come into play when you decide that you want to hold these spaces. So you got to be very, very careful about stepping into this. So, yeah.
One of the things I want to say is it's really important. Several of you are talking about the importance of having these kinds of circles in schools. Many young people come out of homes where you don't have a right to say, this is my body. They come out of homes where beating is the norm. They come out of homes where sexual abuse may be happening. And so so some of the reactions to that can be, people take pride in the fact that, oh, I don't care that somebody's, touching me inappropriately. It doesn't bother me. I've had this said to me, by young women. And so it's really important to say there's another way to think about this, because if a person is not in a place of safety, if they're not in a place where they have a right to say yes or no. And I can just remember when my mother taught in the school system, you could hit children in schools without repercussions. So much less around beating. And one of the things, if you're beaten at a very young age, and I was, you don't learn about the integrity of your body. You don't learn about having that right. And you need to be in a place that is establishing a different norm so that you can say, oh, this is wrong, as opposed to, oh, this is normal, and I'm just going to put up with this. I think that's some of the reasons that some of the women who voted for Trump, knowing that he was a sexual perpetrator, is that they just think it's normal. This is what, and if you're going to be successful, you just put up with it and you keep on stepping. And we want to change. That's why cultural change is so important.
I think it's on point. I think as educator, we need to see three things. As you both said, first thing, like at home, like, are you taking away the kids? No. Like it starts at home. Our caregiver is saying the kids, taking away their muscle of saying no. Like if that's trained out of them, then when they go to school, somebody's violating, it's taken, their voice is already robbed from them. They don't have that. So they're being conditioned to take that. The other part is also society is building that also. Is as we are working towards that, there is the other side that's working for it. Like the music industry is telling you how cool that is. So Keys is like, okay, doing that is a cool thing. I'm trying to be cool. I'm gonna go and brag to my friends because it's a cool thing, versus that is from home and then it's built in what they hear from music or the films and everything is feeding them, embodying them, or that way of being is acceptable. If I'm like that, my friends are gonna think I'm cool, versus what is not cool is reversing that and say, those things are not cool. And that's how I'm accepted, because it goes to belonging for some young people. So I would belong to those kind of people who accept me for doing that. So it's, I think, seeing those issues, where is it being fed? So where is it being fed, where the young people are taking it as a way to belong to part of whatever they think is cool.
Yeah, I just acknowledging Nuela's comment in the chat is about media literacy. It's so important, and it's really interesting because I've been watching a television show right now. It's called I May Destroy You on HBO, and it's a really amazing show in the sense that it's about a woman who has her consent violated, but really what each episode of the show is going through is talking about what you talked about, those gray areas, those times when you feel in your gut that something isn't right, but you don't necessarily, you don't have the words to say why it wasn't right. You don't have the agency to is this not right I need to go to the cops? Is this not right? I need to talk to a friend. Is this not, like, how do I address those issues? And so, like, I really feel like we need to, both as creators of art and also consumers of art, we really need to, like, be thinking about the images that are put out there, what we put out there, and then also what we take in and how we interrogate them. I want to just shift us a little bit towards COVID, because this has really changed how we interact as a community. Like, we were all at home for months and now things are relaxing. We're starting to go out. Some of my friends are like, people don't know how to act anymore. They don't know how to interact with each other because they've been at home so long. What kind of things are coming up for you as people start to move around again, in terms of holding boundaries, telling people boundaries, those kind of things? And I'm going to leave that open for anybody who wants to jump in. Just unmute yourself.
I mean, I guess when I first read this question, this example popped into my head pretty immediately. I decided to go on a socially distanced walk with a friend of mine, and then we got to a bench in Cordonices Park in Berkeley, and I sat down on the opposite end of the bench. It was a pretty long bench, so there's a lot of room between us, and she said, "Do you mind if I take off my mask?" And I said, "No, I don't mind." And then I said, "Do you mind if I take off mine?" And she said, "No, I don't mind either." And it was very easy. It was very simple, but it was just a quick check-in of like, how are you feeling? How is your safety? Are you comfortable? Are you not comfortable? And I think that now it is our responsibility to protect our bodies, to protect other people's bodies, to protect the bodies of the people we live with and share our spaces with, and also to be comfortable as we go through the world. And so that was something that I thought was pretty good. And then once we were walking and there was the risk of getting within 6 feet of each other again, we masked up and we walked home, and it was pretty simple, but it was like just a new added layer of interaction, of just like acknowledging other people's need for safety and your own need for safety.
Yeah, my friend has come. I have a backyard, so my friend comes over with her littles, and they play in my backyard. And whenever they get a little bit close, she just gently tells them, like, hey, you're getting close to Shanna, like, remember to put on your mask, or like, does Shanna have her mask on? Because we want her to be safe and we want to be safe for ourselves. And I just like, and she says that they're like 7, 5, and 3. So she says it like very gently, and they're all, the 3-year-old, not so much, but the other 2, like, they get it. And it's like really sweet, and it's a redirection. But it's something new to get used to.
I want to add, I've actually had a very beautiful experience recently with the COVID consent practice. It was my birthday last week, and I wanted to see people in the physical. And I also knew people didn't necessarily all want to be in the physical. And I set up multiple things to create something that I wanted. And I first reached out to a handful of my closest friends and asked, I have a backyard area, and I said, what would need to be in place for you to feel comfortable and safe to be at my house, whether you would come or not, because you still might not come. And they gave certain things that I didn't really think about. And one of them said, I'm not coming over at all unless it's just you. I'm like, cool, all good. So I decided to do a Zoom thing for the people who did not want to. And then for the people who said they would be willing to come over to the house, I started a separate thread and said, okay, these are the precautions that I'm taking. I'm going to sanitize the house. I'm going to do this, but I want you to know I won't be wearing a mask in my own house. I'm just not going to, and neither is my daughter. So these are the things that I'm not willing to these are the boundaries that I'm not willing to shift for someone else. So if you're willing and interested in coming over, what are practices that you need to have happen in that context? And you know, there was some people that said stuff, but really mostly people just sort of accepted what that was, and they came how they wanted to come. Some people had masks on, a lot of people, several people didn't. There was only a handful of folks, but one of my friends came over and he was one of the few people that was masked up, had his gloves on, he was doing his thing. And afterwards I just said, you know, I wanted to really appreciate you for having your strong boundaries, because it might have felt like you weren't cool. Tess went back to this cool thing around boundaries, right? Because several other people are like, oh, we're good. Things are sanitized. Let's play games. So we're playing cards and doing all these things. Everyone was an adult there. Everyone was able to have consent around that. I put out my stuff, so it wasn't my job to decide what other people were comfortable with, but I wanted to just give him props for being willing to say, my boundaries are this, and he takes care of his parents. So there were certain things that he needed to do because his lifestyle. One of my best friends was like, well, I'm not coming to your house. I'm not, because she had her own particular thing and that was hers. And so to me, that is that thing around how do we, maybe it's a thread, maybe it's a conversation. What are people's needs around this particular thing? And some people their needs are much higher. So like, I'm not leaving the house for anything. I have a friend who won't buy groceries until everything has been sanitized before it comes into the house. She has her own reasons for that. No shame, no gain. You know, it's all to the good, but that is that practice of saying what is actually right for me, and then how do I ask for that? If you're going somewhere and people invite you over, okay, how many people are going to be there? Is it going to be inside or outside? Are we wearing masks? I stand stronger in my own stuff to stand rooted in what I truly believe, and that goes back to that gut and back to that saying what really feels right for us.
Well, there's something for me. I have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, so I'm being really careful about going out. And I also, you know, have noticed that when my granddaughter and my son have wanted to come over, that I've wanted to be looser. But there's something about the discourse around rights in this country. So as I've looked at news articles where people are refusing to wear masks in areas or stores where there's, you know, you have to wear a mask to walk in, or actually somebody spitting on somebody, you know, and I'm remembering how during the AIDS epidemic that, you know, people spitting on you or biting you were actually, you know, people were charged with assault for that. But that somehow this discourse of my rights, I want to have my quote rights, even if they infringe on your body. And there's something that is like a disconnect about this, about there's a falsity, and I'm just really concerned about it. I mean, I don't know quite how to think about it, but I know something is really, really off when people's needs to be protected is being blocked, you know, say by their governors or whatever. And there's something about consent in here that I just think is important.
Rose, I saw you. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, I think consent during the time of COVID is especially interesting as a teenager, when you're going out and you're socializing and you're learning who you are as a person. As somebody who has asthma, so that makes me higher risk, it's been an interesting experience to really have to set those boundaries for myself. And it's been interesting to see how my friends and the people around me in my community have been reacting to that. It's like, it's just an intense process, because I don't know, it's awkward to ask your friends, actually, I need you to do this for me because it's for my health and it's for my safety. It's been a super intense process, but an important growth process for me as a teenager and as a young person, just making sure that I have my boundaries set very clear and I'm staying safe and I'm keeping my people safe as well. So yeah, I just wanted to add that youth perspective.
Anyone else? Because this has come up a couple of times of people having to say, like, what is the thing, the reason? behind why I have the boundaries I have. So it came up in an article, this idea of like forced intimacy, people being forced to disclose their health issues or being forced to disclose. And I'm sure it also comes up when we're talking about like, like someone shouldn't have to say whether or not their consent has been violated in the past in order to receive consent now, right? So like, how are folks navigating that? Like are you feeling pressured to tell people your medical history or your past history in order to justify your boundaries? Anybody? Totally fine. I'm not gonna call on anybody because like that's exactly what we're talking about. Like, being forced to disclose your personal business.
I haven't. I can just say that, I haven't felt that I've had to say that, but I think there's some health related things. Like for me, my nephew does my computers, and he is deathly allergic to cats. And I know, and while I love cats, I've made this decision that as long as that happens, as he's working with me, I can't have cats in the house. I can't have people, and who have been playing with cats. And I sometimes say that, and I do say the reason. And I'm thinking about, do I say the reason out of fear? Do I say the reason to make it go over better? And so I'm thinking I do say I have COPD. But or that there's just more concern because me and my husband are both older, and so I find myself saying that, I think because the norms of hugging and hospitality that I had before COVID were so much the norms. I do tend to hug people, I mean the people I know. So yeah, so there is, I think, a little bit of maybe a guilt, a need to explain, a need to make it more palatable to other people. So I am noticing that.
I think that,
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think that, that those feelings, that pressure to like explain, right, is something that's we're conditioned to do, even when it comes to like sexual spaces or experiences, right? Like you have to explain why you don't want to. The feeling that you have to explain why you don't want to maybe participate in a particular activity. But really, at the end of the day, I mean, you really don't need to explain. When it comes to consent, all you gotta say is, I don't feel comfortable doing this, or I'm not doing this. And at least when I'm talking to students, like you don't have to give an explanation. That stating your boundaries should be enough, right? But I think COVID is bringing up a lot of it's challenging for us because, like you're saying, I mean, so many of us have been conditioned, when it comes to hospitality or just sharing space in non-sexual ways. We're even more, it's just a very strange thing. So we're trying to navigate it, right? And I definitely have had some moments where, yeah, I teach consent, and I've had some experiences in the last couple months where I've felt uncomfortable, but didn't feel, for whatever reason, didn't come out and say, you know what, could you please put your mask on? Or could you actually not come inside without a mask? Or, all of these different, or could you actually not, like, I'm actually not hugging right now, right? Like when somebody's going in for the hug and it's like, so yeah, it's a journey, it's a process, but I think it's really important for us to just, as people mentioned earlier, to just practice saying our no's, reflecting on what we're comfortable with, right? And then practicing like stating those boundaries and then sticking to them. And also like not assuming that we know what people's boundaries are, or that they know what ours are. And so that's why communication is so important.
I am looking at questions from the audience, so I just want to make sure that we get to those. Especially this question. So we have a question from Kiana in the audience. Have any of you had experiences working in schools where issues of consent are addressed by local police? I found it really troubling that students were being criminalized instead of taught or having opportunities for restorative justice. And this made students more likely to be protective of one another than to be open to dialogue and consent education. Have any of you had any experiences with police and talking about consent with students?
I've had many, but I feel like I've talked a lot. So I feel like Ruben, I know Ruben's got some too, but I've had several.
Not necessarily around consent, but just, you know, different situations where the police were called instead of it being a restorative process. And the minute that you do that, you lose trust in that child or that student or the community. You know, the minute the first response you think is best is to call the police, when it could be something that could be handled internally. You know what I'm saying? You could call parents, you can set up a meeting, you can involve everybody from the community if you need to do that. But the minute you involve the juvenile justice system, this can impact that child's life forever.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And that kid might never get to come back from that. You know what I'm saying? Kids make dumb mistakes. You know, we all was kids, the older folks in the room. You know, we've all made dumb mistakes in the past. But if we was, you know, judged or treated by the mistakes that we made today, that's just, you know, that's terrible, man. That's a bad way to go about things. So I don't know what that person is dealing with, whoever said that, but hopefully, you know, they have a better way of handling, because restorative work is super important rather than doing things punitively.
I can speak a little bit to just our training in terms of being mandated reporters as well. I think the big thing that I learned from being trained on that is that the minute you make that call, you can't take that call back. So you have to be very clear before you start involving authorities. And also that the way you avoid those situations is putting the supports and the things in place before you get to that point. So I think for like folks like myself who like work with young people and work with families, it's really important to have support for caregivers, to have support for young people so that they feel like they can like come to you before it gets to a point, and also to be like helping them find out how to disrupt those behaviors before it gets to a place where authorities have to be called in.
I think the challenge, particularly around sexual assault, is that in California, sexual assault is a mandated report. And I don't know if it's shifted in New York, but in New York specifically, it used to be a place where sexual assault and rape was not a mandated reportable thing. And you could see the reports that young women specifically would report is skyrocketed in places like New York because they knew that it wasn't an automatic call to a authority, to the police. And these days, it's not CPS that comes out, it's a police officer that comes out. They'll come to your door. And I've had situations where young women want to tell me something, but they know what the restrictions are. So they can't even share, because the idea that the police and making a police report is the answer is such a false narrative. And as someone who has worked with sexual assault survivors and seen people go through the police system, been in a courtroom while young women listen to their rapists talk about how they're not I mean, just the trauma you have to go through, the process is horrific. It's horrific. And then the percentage of actual accountability that happens to people is so low. Young people and adults who are has been assaulted have such a little agency in regards to that work. And restorative justice, I've used restorative justice in sexual assault situations where I've had parents in the room and mothers specifically, and then the mothers are talking about how they were assaulted. The mothers talking about how they were molested. And it was this one particular situation. It was a huge 3-hour circle that I held with this young man and his mother and a young woman and her mother. And I had tons of prep work ahead of time, talking to everybody, getting them prepared, getting them able to sit in that process. The healing that happened in that 3 hours was more than any juvenile justice system could do. If it had gone to a juvenile courts, if he had been arrested, he would have been charged as an adult and then come out with a sexual assault felony on him. He would have been labeled as a sexual offender for the rest of his life. So the way that young people get caught up in these type of things, when you have places where you can actually do transformative healing, it's so sad. But it's like, if you're dealing with the court system, kind of what Ruben was saying, once you call that police, it is at this situation specifically, this young man's absolute best interest to lie. Restorative justice is about telling the truth. So if I'm going to do a process, but the police are involved, this young man's life depends on him lying or telling the truth. And for his life, I would not that I'm going to tell him to lie, but you know what I'm saying? Like, it's not in his best interest to actually do true accountability work if his life is on the line in the other way. But when you actually do restorative practice and restorative process, it is at his own best interest to heal that part of him that created that situation, and her ability to hear what happened, what are the answers that she needed to that situation for her to understand and process. People forget that survivors of violence, survivors of harm often need the other person to heal. They need to understand answers to stories. Why did that happen? Why me? Why what was going on for you? Do you know how much you've hurt me? Do you know what this did to me? I need you to feel the pain that I feel. And then I can truly know that there might have been some justice. So until we can change some of the rules, unfortunately, maybe this is outing myself too much, but I tell young women, don't tell me details and this is what will happen, but talk to me in story, because this is that's the mandated reporting challenge around trying to support people when you are just scripted into a system that is not taking care of young people.
I think to add on that, it feels like, I'm talking as a person from a different country, from a different culture, where society, the community is disconnected with the justice system. The police and the community don't feel like it's a one thing. There's a huge disconnection. It does not make sense for you, once you call the police, that you can't take it back. You can't change that course. It's artificially set. Like where I come from, it could be in police once the elders who are, historically or ancient tradition of doing restorative justice or transformation work, they will go and pick the kid up from there, and they can reverse that. They can change that. It doesn't need to be put and written his whole life within that, where this process can bring the kid back and go through that ritual practice they go to heal both sides, to heal the community and restructure, versus you make one misstep, it's the whole life is written off. It just doesn't make sense.
We're almost at time, but I really want to just throw this out to the panel, because everything you're saying right now is really making me think, like, what is the vision? How how do we build as a community a practice of consent? How do we build as a community a practice of restorative justice when that consent is violated? Like, and especially to the young people, like, what do you want to see from a future of us really being in a practice of consent with each other?
I think Tess just mentioned it, you know. Restorative justice is an indigenous practice, you know, and it involves the village. And, you know, as us as a community connected, when we exile one person out of that community, it doesn't just affect that person that got exiled, it also affects the people that that person is connected to. You know what I'm saying? So we are all connected to each other. And I think we gotta create, you know, the dream that we want to see in our own communities. Because, you know, to be honest, in Black and brown communities, you know how the system is set up for us, you know, and the oppression that, you know, that's impacted us for history, you know, for centuries. So we just got to figure it out, man. And I think this is the first start. You know what I'm saying? I think we were doing this organically, but now we actually have some type of mechanism to move it forward. You know what I'm saying? So just going back, it's like we're going back to the roots. We're going back to indigenous practice and starting from where we were before all of this, you know, colonial patriarch, systemic racism and sexism, so to speak.
I think that we have to interrupt this connection between love and liking and appreciation and being said no to. Because I think that it's so much bigger than even just the issue of sex. We need, people need to have, it's a systemic issue. If the only way you're going to survive in your house is being touched inappropriately or being raped in your house, I mean, what's that going to teach you? So we need people to know that the culture of safety is okay, and that somebody loving you, caring about you, providing you with the resources that you need to survive is not based on you're always saying yes to whatever they need, whether that's about friendship, whether that's about parenting, whether any of that. We need a culture where you can say yes or no, and that's normal and human.
I think definitely something I want to see is just people truly valuing themselves, because that's something I see a lot, especially with young women, is just a lack of value for one's own bodily integrity, for one's own boundaries, all of these sorts of things, of just writing them off as being ridiculous or being superfluous. And I think that having a deep sense of love for yourself and for all of that entails, and then like turning that out and having that sense of love and respect for other people's bodies and boundaries, that's the deep like internal feeling that I'm looking for, that I think is going to be so key. And like I was saying earlier, I think that understanding that it doesn't have to be a whole ceremony, but that it can be casual and that it can be simple is going to be really important, of just like making it part of conversations, making it as simple as saying hello, I think is going to be really important. And then also, sort of to touch on this restorative justice point, I've been thinking about this a lot and how I want to approach this and how I would want something to happen, or how I want things to go if something happened to me. And I think that it is in the best interest of everyone to do restorative justice, because that's how you stop these sorts of things from happening again. And that's so essential and really important to understand. So getting that sort of like trust with yourself and then with other people, and in your boundaries and their boundaries, is going to be super key. And I hope that we can see a great blossoming of that in the coming years.
We should make it cool. We should make it cool for young people to say, this is how we roll, as a thing where that being a knowing restorative justice is part of how to be cool, to knowing how to treat other people. Is I think a lot of young people do it from wanting to belong, wanting to be cool. as part of the component is just changing that conversation dialogue and making it a way of life. Like I was 5 years old when they put me to be seeing through that ritual. And I never was taught, but I know everything is there because I was placed there to learn. So that kind of things to create really a culture in the community that we embody that as we grow and as we raise kids, that they don't have to see it as a thing out there. It's something that lives inside of them and build that up.
I also think there needs to, oh, sorry.
Are you unmuting too? I see people unmuting, but like, yeah, I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to speak. Yeah, Kira, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I also think there needs to be more of a culture of empathy. And I think that's largely where restorative justice comes from. It's like the idea that, I think someone mentioned this earlier about how you need to sort of understand the pain that you put someone through. But I think that's super important in creating a culture where it's easy to say yes or no, where you know how your actions are going to affect someone, and you understand if they don't want that effect, then they can say, like, I don't know. I just think that that's really important, and it's touched on a lot when kids are young, but I don't always feel like it's done to a good extent. Yeah.
I just wanted to say quickly, I think there's an opening right now. A lot of people all over the country are talking about police-free schools. This is a really good time to talk about other institutions and practices that can help communities and schools be safe, and restorative justice is one of those. And so people who are part of the RJ movement or the police-free schools movement, like, we need them to know what consent culture is and why it's important. Right? We need them to know that consent culture is not only about understanding what consent is, but to make sure that survivors are believed and supported, right? And so if we can just kind of build these connections, because it is all connected, and I really hope that schools are gonna look different in the next couple of years, because I don't know what's going on in Cali, but in Philly, we're really pushing a lot. The Philadelphia Student Union and Youth United for Change, a lot of different youth groups are pushing the school district on these, the policing in schools. And so while we do have police in schools, however, they need to also know what consent is, right? They need to know what consent is, and they need to know how to support survivors. And we've had a lot of issues in Philly in that regard as well. So yeah, this is a movement, right? Yeah. So we just all do our part as educators, as activists, as social workers, as youth, parents. We all have a role to play, and so let's get to know each other and build together, because we need each other. We can't rely on one. We can't just rely on one group of people to make the change.
Rose, I'm gonna make sure you speak. I see.
I was gonna say something, but I forgot what it was. I think it was, can you remind me of the question, please?
What are we envisioning, like, as a new way forward in talking about consent and restorative justice? And
for me personally, I would love to see consent being discussed at every age, with appropriate context, of course, and making sure that it's digestible for young ones and older youth as well. But also, when it comes to restorative justice, understanding the survivors' like mental stability and the way that they're going to actually react to the restorative justice, and if it's ultimately going to be a healing process. Because I'm going to speak from my own experience. It wasn't the most healing process. It was actually re-traumatizing for me to go through some restorative justice, and eventually I was able to find peace within myself with that. But I think when we're leading restorative justice circles, as youth and particularly as adults, I think it's important to make sure that the survivor is being communicated with about what's going to be discussed in those circles beforehand, as to make sure that it's not re-traumatizing. But yeah, I just wanted to throw that into the circle, that checking in with the survivor throughout the process of restorative justice is something I would also like to see in the future.
And I think that goes back really to Nuela's point about, like, this work is hard on every side, you know, if you're facilitating it, if you're, you know, if you're participating in it, you know, we are in this moment reimagining how we interact with each other. We're finding new ways of being, and it's really like when you come into this work, you're gonna be exposed. You're gonna see like all the lovely and ugly parts of yourself. And I think part of the work of restorative justice is being able to acknowledge and deal with that, because we want people to be able to bring their whole self, but be able to bring their whole self into the community in a way that's safe and good for everyone. Yeah. Anyone else? And it's totally fine. I like these discussions have been so rich and like so deep, and an hour and a half is like not nearly enough time for any of it. And the reason we titled it Creating Connections is because all of these things are so interconnected. You know, like we talked about advocacy and policing earlier this week, and it directly is connected to talking about restorative justice and consent. So I really appreciate everyone for being here, for participating in the discussion, for continuing to move forward. This is a movement, not a moment. And we're going to continue to push and have these discussions that are not always easy. I appreciate the expertise in the virtual room. Thank you so much for bringing your expertise to this. Thank you so much, those of you who are watching on Facebook. We didn't, unfortunately, get to all of your questions, but, you know, continue to have these conversations online, in person. Continue to think about how we're interacting with each other, how we're keeping each other safe. And yeah, if you are interested in finding more resources, we have a link tree on our Destiny Art Center Instagram. It's plenty of resources there. If you are in the Oakland area and you need resources like food, we visit the food bank weekly, and we are happy. Please contact us if you need any of those resources. I will try and make sure that the organizations that our folks are connected to are also on that link tree, so that you can get in contact with them about more resources with like Educators for Consent and things, and Our Joy. And yeah, thank you. This has been another great conversation, and I appreciate everyone for being here. And we will see you next Thursday, when we will be talking to young activists from the UK, Brazil, and India about global youth movements and what Black Lives Matter looks like around the globe. Thank you.
Thank you, Destiny. Thank you, Shanna.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Shanna.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.